I want to introduce you all to Ms. Julissa Arce, who's going to be our speaker tonight. She's a best-selling author, speaker, social justice advocate, and former Wall Street executive. She's a best-selling author of My Underground American Dream. She's a leading voice in the fight of social justice, immigrant rights, and education equality. Her second book, Someone Like Me, is her first young adult book and was published in 2018. Julissa is a contributor of Crooked Media, CNBC, and one of the hosts of Crooked Conversations. Her book, My Underground American Dream, is currently being developed as a television series with producer and actor America Ferrera. Her commitment to education for all young people led her to co-create the Ascend Educational Fund, where she serves as chairwoman of the board. AEF is a college scholarship and mentorship program for immigrant students in New York City, regardless of their ethnicity, national origin, and immigration status. Since its founding in 2002, AEF has awarded over $400,000 in scholarships. Prior to being an advocate, she built a successful career on Wall Street working for Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch and had seemingly achieved the American dream, yet she was not part of what defined American. Julissa immigrated to America from Mexico at the age of 11. It was undocumented for almost 15 years, some of them spent rising to prominence on Wall Street. She made national and international headlines when she revealed that she achieved the American dream of wealth and status at Goldman Sachs while being undocumented. Julissa now uses her inspirational story to change the conversation around immigration. She has officially been sworn in as American citizen as of August 2014. Her story has a joyful ending as she fights so more people can stay the same. So I welcome you all to introduce Julissa Arce.
I'm going to read a short chapter from my book called Someone Like Me, which is the young adult book. I wanted to write this book, Someone Like Me, because when I was growing up in school, I never read a single book that was written by a Latina author or that had Latino characters in them. Even today, in children's books, there are only 5% of characters that are Latinx. So you're more likely to find a truck or a bunny in a children's book than you are to find someone like me. And so when I was thinking about my experience in school, I grew up in Texas, and when I was thinking about my experience and what could have made that experience better, I thought, wouldn't have been great if I had read a book that had characters like me, because then I think I would have grown up to think that my story was important, and I would have grown up to think that my experience was important, because not seeing yourself reflected in the stories that you're reading, I think sends a strong message that we're invisible and that we don't matter. And I wanted young people to have a different experience than that. Okay, so I'm going to read you this chapter, which is kind of halfway through the book. The first part of the book spends a lot of time when I was in Mexico, because before I came to live in the U.S., I lived in Mexico, and I came here when I was 11, which means that I had really beautiful memories of when I was growing up in Mexico, and I wanted to share that in this book. But the chapter I'm going to read from is a chapter that takes place when I was already living in San Antonio, Texas. The next night, as I laid in bed, a whole new series of questions and thoughts entered my mind. Why could I never visit Mexico again? And if I did, was it true that I could never come back to America? All I'd heard was that I couldn't have my quinceañera, and I knew this wasn't a party that I could throw for myself when I was older. It wasn't a moment that I could recreate. It would be gone forever. Does everyone here know what a quinceañera is? If you don't, just imagine like a really big wedding without the groom. I was too young, or maybe too naive, to understand that on that night, my mother had shared a secret with me that would define and haunt me for years to come. The consequences were much greater than not having a party. My family was in Mexico, but my parents were here. My life was in both places. There had to be some way around it. What if Tiffany's parents could adopt me? I figured that would make me an official American citizen. Certainly, that would take care of my expired visa problem. I started to think about my visa as a problem that I could fix. I had told Tiffany about my devastating news. She didn't even have to say anything. I could see how much she cared. She had become more like a sister than a friend. My own sisters felt like they were a million miles away. I hardly spoke to them, especially now that Aris was married. I spoke to Tiffany's parents the next time I saw them, and they agreed to adopt me if my parents allowed it. That was how much they loved me. But my parents were too proud to have their daughter adopted, even if it was just to gain my American citizenship. My parents didn't have any other solutions for my expired visa. I don't think they realized what being undocumented would mean for my future. And yet, I started to figure it out pretty quickly. I was in my parents' room watching TV one morning when I came across Fox News. I stopped on the channel because the anchor, a beautiful blonde woman, was talking about Mexican immigrants living in Texas. I was a Mexican immigrant living in Texas. I watched the report in horror as the TV host called Mexican immigrants without legal status or citizenship illegals and illegal aliens. I was smart enough to know that now, as a 14-year-old high school freshman, I was one of them. I was no longer just a Mexican, which seemed bad enough in certain people's eyes. I was now an illegal. Or worse, an illegal alien, like something from another planet that wasn't even human. The news reported on the illegals the way they would report on a murderer or a thief. My face got hot with anger. I wanted to jump in the TV and yell, "I'm not an alien." When I thought about criminals, I didn't picture someone like me. And yet, people seem to throw the word illegal around with the same disdain in their voice. Is that how people would treat me if they knew? I didn't feel illegal. I didn't think anyone suspected anything. Having an expired visa didn't make me feel like a criminal. I moved seamlessly from middle school to high school, just like any other student. I had good grades and my accent was almost gone, so no one questioned anything. And it quickly became clear that's the way it had to stay. You can't tell anyone, my mom told me. If anyone finds out, you could be deported. Deportation meant I would be separated from my parents and my little brother. I would have a criminal record in the US. I could end up in a detention center, a kind of jail for men, women, and children who are undocumented. Making sure I never said anything about my visa or my status became front and center in every conversation I had from that moment forward. I didn't want to be deported. I didn't want to be separated from my parents. As bad as things were sometimes, they were my parents and I loved them. America was my home now. Soon, my own parents started using my immigration status as a threat. "Don't you go breaking any laws, Julissa. You'll get deported." When I was little, they used to threaten me with La Llorona, the Mexican female version of the boogeyman. As I got older, I realized La Llorona wasn't real. But the migra, or ICE, wasn't something mythical used to scare children. La migra was real and scarier than any monster I could imagine. So, thank you. So as I mentioned, this is a chapter right after I found out that I was undocumented. I came to the US when I was 11 with a tourist visa, and when that visa expired, I was no longer supposed to be in the US. And I spent the next 15 years from the day that my mom told me that my visa had expired and I couldn't go to Mexico to have my quinceañera, really worried about no one finding out that I was undocumented. But I also kind of thought that somehow it could get fixed, that somehow if I studied hard enough or if I learned English well enough, that it wouldn't matter that I was undocumented. But of course, as the years went by, I came to realize that it didn't matter how well I spoke English or what my grades looked like. Being undocumented still meant that I couldn't go to college, because in 2001, when I graduated from high school, there were no laws that allowed undocumented students to go to college, and that was around the time when I graduated from high school. So I won't. Hopefully, I think some of you are getting a book, and I don't want to spoil the whole book, but I will read you something. Another short. This is very short. From my underground American dream, which is the first book that I wrote, and the book that Nikki read in my bio is being developed into a TV series, and we can talk more about that also. But this is a chapter when and I'm sure some of the questions that you'll ask will sort of fill in some of the gaps between the chapter I just read and the chapter I'm about to read now. But just for some context, After college, I made my way here to New York City and started working at Goldman Sachs after I did an internship there. And I spent about 7 years at Goldman and became a vice president there. And most of the time that I was working there, I was undocumented. It was a quiet early September morning on the 40th floor of One New York Plaza when my phone rang. It was my sister. It was my sister and I calling from Mexico. I was immediately alarmed. "Hi, Julissa, how are you?" she said. "What happened?" I responded. "What happened?" "Dad is in the hospital. It all happened so fast. 2 days ago, he just started peeing blood. He's losing his sight." "I have to call you back," I said. I could feel the tears swelling up in my eyes. And there is no crying on the trading floor, not even if your father might be dying. We hung up and I walked down the hall. I opened the doors to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and thanksgiving, present your request to God, I prayed. As tears ran down my cheeks, I prayed over and over again. I could barely function the rest of the day. A series of phone calls with my sister and mother confirmed that my father was really ill, possibly dying. I should have gotten on a plane immediately, but how could I get back into the US? I had risked getting deported for much less before, like that time I went to the party with Chris, or every time I drank in college before I was 21. I reminded myself that sometimes I just had to live, no matter the consequences. But the stakes were so much higher now. I had a career, I had a life in the United States. Everything I had worked for, everything my parents had sacrificed for. Siri is listening, so I'm gonna turn her off. I kept going to the bathroom to cry. I told Kate my father was very sick, and she asked if I wanted to go home early. I said no, at least here I can keep my mind off of it. There's nothing I can do from home. Well, don't you want to go to Mexico then? No, my mother insists it's not that serious, I said, and I've got to close this deal. I'm okay. But I wasn't okay. I felt the stress in my stomach, in every muscle of my body. I stayed at work until 10 p.m. that night, calling back and forth to my mother and my sister constantly for updates. They kept saying he was okay. Then my aunt called me. "Julissa," she said, "your mother and sister are not being honest with you. Your father is not well. He's not okay. They don't even know if he'll make it through the night." What? Why are they lying to me? Why have they hidden this from me? I was so angry. Whatever their intentions were, I was absolutely furious that they kept me in the dark. This was my father, and it was my decision to make. I wanted to blame my mother and my sister, but the reality was that I knew it in my gut that my dad was sicker than they were letting on. I made up my mind to get on a plane, just dropped everything and go. Then I decided to stay, because that's what my dad would want. Can I even get on an international flight without a US passport? The border was still lax in some areas where there were frequent border crossings. It was pretty easy to drive a car across the border into Mexico and just say American citizen, or so I thought. I could fly to Laredo and rent a car and drive down, I thought. Getting back would be the tricky part. Even if I couldn't make it by driving, maybe I could use some of my hefty new salary to pay a mule to smuggle me across. Even if I pulled something like that off, I'd be setting myself up for misery in the future. If the DREAM Act ever passed, I wouldn't be able to be a part of it. If the DREAM Act required that you've been in the United States since the age of 17 or younger, as soon as I crossed the border into Mexico, I was giving myself a 10-year penalty. If it was ever discovered that I left the United States and crossed back illegally, I wouldn't be able to fix my immigration status, even if I married a US citizen, even if in the future I had a US-born children. "Julissa, you're not risking your life. If something happens to you, I'll die, my mother said. I went home wondering if maybe all of this was a sign from God. Maybe it really was time for me to leave. Maybe it was time for me to just fly home and leave my American life behind. I agonized over it for hours. Thanks.
The first question that we'll be asking is, how did your life change from being undocumented to having citizenship?
So I got married And I'll tell you guys a story. After that chapter that I read, I was dating someone at the time, and I had never told him that I was undocumented because I didn't think that I could trust people with my immigration status. And so even though we'd known each other since college and we'd been dating for a couple of years, I had never shared with him that I was undocumented. And so I think if you can imagine like your boyfriend or your girlfriend, their dad is like dying and they're not going to go visit them, right? That's like a hard thing to understand unless you know why. And I finally told him about my immigration status after this phone call with my sister. And a few weeks later, I started really talking about like going back to Mexico. As I read in the chapter, like I didn't want to be here anymore because I just felt like it didn't matter what I had accomplished. There was no way for me to change my immigration status. And so I told him, and then probably like 6 months later, we were like sitting at my apartment, and he looks at me and he says, "Why don't we get married?" And all I could think was, this is the worst proposal ever. Like, why are you not down on one knee and where's my ring? But a few months after that, we got married, and because he's a U.S. citizen, I was able to adjust my immigration status. And it is a little bit of I think to me, it's like one of the biggest ironies of my life, because my mom brought me to this country so that I could be an independent woman and not have to depend on anyone. And then the only way that I could fix my immigration status was through this man. And I mean, I loved him, and I'm very glad that he, that he was able to, that he's the reason why I was able to become a U.S. citizen. But it's still kind of ironic to me that that was the only way to do it. But I am really grateful because on August 8th of 2014, I became a U.S. citizen 20 years after I first came to live in the U.S.
Well, the second question we have for you, how were you able to work for Goldman Sachs while being undocumented?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And normally when I just do like a talk versus just like a reading, I talk about this. So I this chapter that I read actually hits on a lot of what you guys are asking, which is, I really thought when I was in college that the DREAM Act would pass, because the DREAM Act was first introduced in 2001. And for those of you that don't know what the DREAM Act is, it's basically a proposed law that would allow people like myself who came to the U.S. when we were kids to get on a path to citizenship. That's like the most basic way to explain it. There's of course like a bunch of restrictions and qualifications that you have to meet, and it would still be a very long process, but it would at the very least sort of open that door. And the first time the DREAM Act was introduced, just to give you a sense, was in 2001. I was a freshman in college, and that was 18 years ago. And every time that it got reintroduced, I would think, okay, this is a time, and then it would not pass. And since 2001, the DREAM Act has been introduced in Congress 10 times, at least 10 times, and each time it has failed for one reason or another. And so when I was seeing this happen, and I was about to graduate in 2005 from the University of Texas at Austin, I made a really difficult decision to buy a fake green card and buy a fake Social Security card. And I knew that I was breaking the law, but I also knew that the law was breaking me, and it was breaking my family apart. And it was like literally breaking my back and breaking my soul. And I just thought, this is the only way, and I have to try. And I still didn't know whether it was going to work or not, right? And these are like very different times, right? In 2005, companies didn't have like the type of scrutiny that they do now. But to be honest with you, I still don't know how it worked, because I went through like a very extensive background check, and then I had to go through background checks with like the SEC and FINRA and like government organizations to get my trading licenses. And so I still to this day don't know how it all worked, but I'm certainly glad that it did. And but that was the way that I was able to work there.
So following up,
Think about follow-up questions, because I saw some of you go. So you can ask questions after to clarify whatever I didn't touch on.
so following up with that question, what tips do you have for undocumented students who want to go into the finance industry?
Yeah. So, now not every undocumented student has DACA, right? Which is like a program that gives you a 2-year work permit and protects you from deportation, and that's like kind of all really that it is, right? But the people who do have DACA can like legally work in the U.S. for 2 years, right? And you have to renew it. And of course, there's the Supreme Court case that's going to be heard on November 12th that's going to determine the fate of the program. So there's a lot of uncertainty. But I'll give you some like aspirational tips and then some very practical ones. And I'll start with the practical. If you want to work in finance, and especially if you want to work on Wall Street, like places like Goldman and Merrill Lynch and Morgan Stanley and sort of all of those places, the very first thing that you have to do is to like have as high of GPA as possible, because you're making it way harder on yourself if you don't. I mean, I remember when we were like recruiting, we would look at GPAs and there would be a stack for like 3.5 and above, and then 3.5 and below GPAs, and there were very few from the below 3.5 GPA pile that would actually like get interviews, right? And so, grades aren't everything, but they like certainly help a lot. So to the extent that you can focus on like getting the best grades you can, that certainly is going to help. And then of course, like doing internships, and it doesn't have to be. I know how annoying that is, because I remember applying for internships and then they required me to have previous experience, and then I would think, well, how can I get an internship if it's asking me to get an internship and I've never had an internship? Like, that seems so dumb. But I applied to like a bunch of different internships that weren't related to finance at all. Like, I interned at the Chicago Fire, which is a Major League Soccer team, and you're looking at probably like the shortest MLS mascot ever. I was just in Chicago and I was asking people, like, do you guys remember Sparky, which is the name of the mascot? And they were like, yeah, we've taken pictures with Sparky. And I was like, oh, well, great to meet you, because I used to dress up as the mascot for this Major League Soccer team. And it was funny because when I put that on my resume, above everything else that I had done, that's like the one thing that recruiters wanted to talk to me about. They like wanted to know how I became the MLS mascot and how what it was like, and so sometimes like the things that you might not think that it might suck to do, like it sucked to be in like 100-degree weather. We're in this huge suit carrying 5-year-old kids that were like way too heavy for me to carry. But at the end of the day, like that experience really paid off. And so think about what experiences you might have, what kind of off the beaten path opportunities that you might can add to your resume that would really help. So those are like very practical things, right? More aspirational, I think, we're in a really difficult situation right now. Like there's no shying away from that. Like the situation right now really sucks for undocumented students because there's so much uncertainty around what's going to happen. But the best thing that I can say, and I know this is gonna sound kind of, well, duh, but truly it's like not give up, because you never know how things might change and when an opportunity might come that you can actually take advantage of it. I graduated from high school in May of 2001, and in June of 2001, so a month later, Texas became the first state in the US to allow undocumented students to go to college, pay in-state tuition, and receive state financial aid, which to me now seems kind of crazy because, of course, we know like Texas is a very conservative state, but Texas was the first state. So like 18 years ago, Texas passed the DREAM Act. I mean, in New York State, it just passed this year. Texas, think about it, Texas, it passed 18 years ago. And it happened a month after I graduated from high school. And so I was able to go to college because of that law. And I always think about all the times I wanted to give up in high school, because I used to think, well, what's the point of like studying so hard if I can't even go to college? And if I had listened to myself, I probably wouldn't have been able to go to college because I wouldn't have had the grades. I wouldn't have had like what I needed to actually go in. And so I think about that now. Like whatever your dreams are, keep working towards those dreams, because you never know what can happen. And it's gonna really suck if something does happen and then you gave up and now you're just not qualified, right? And so just don't give up, because you never know what can happen. And I really, we're all really fighting really hard so that we can have a permanent solution for you and for everybody that's going through that situation right now.
The next question we have is, what struggles did you face when you worked in Wall Street, yet you were an undocumented woman of color?
Yeah, I mean, I think the undocumented part is, obviously I was afraid all the time, like anybody might find out, and that would be like the last, like that would be it. Like I used to worry about getting caught all the time, and that stress showed up as physical ailments. Like I used to have the worst headaches, like the worst backache, the worst stomach aches, and I would go to the doctor all the time, and they wouldn't be able to tell me what was wrong with me. And now I realize that what was wrong with me is that I was really stressed out from having to keep the secret and from having to live my life scared all the time. But beyond that, when I looked around the room, there weren't a lot of people of color, period, and especially not women of color. And I remember once going to a client meeting, and the client asked me if I could bring the coffee, because he thought that I was the assistant and not like the vice president who was there to sell him some products. And the first time that it happened, it was like really jarring. And then like the 10th time that it happened, I was kind of prepared for it. And so what I started doing is I would never meet a client before I talked to them on the phone first. So I would always want to talk to a client on the phone so that I could show them how like smart I was without them like seeing me first, and then I would show up. And it kind of sucks that you have to do those things, but I just kind of had to start figuring out like how do I make this work. So I had a lot of instances like that, but I also had a lot of really great mentors and people that like taught me the things that I needed to do to make sure that I was like getting paid, right? The same as like my colleagues, because as we know, Latinas get paid 54 cents on the dollar to their white male counterparts. And I didn't want that to happen to me. I'm sure it did sometimes, but I would always have conversations with my boss about, I would go in there and I would literally ask, what do I need to do to get promoted this year? And I would make her give me like very specific things that I needed to do. And then 6 months later, I would check in and I would say, okay, these are the things you told me to do. Am I on track? Or I would say, like, these are the deals that I've made. What can I expect at the end of the year? And I would like really kind of hold her accountable to those things so that I wouldn't be disappointed at the price at the end of the year.
So, what response did you receive from your colleagues if you ever revealed your status to them when you worked at Goldman Sachs?
So when I worked at Goldman, I never told anyone that I was undocumented. I think for, obviously, like, I could have gotten fired. I would have gotten fired. But also, there were some colleagues of mine. I think of one person specifically that I was very, like, he became a very good friend of mine. And there were several times when, like, I wanted to tell him because, like, not being able to talk to anyone about this really big thing in your life, like, it kind of really weighs on you. And there were several times when I wanted to tell him. And I knew that I could trust him. But I also never wanted him to put him in a position where then he also had to lie for me. And so I never told anyone while I was working there. Obviously, like in 2015, my story was shared very widely and very publicly through this article in Bloomberg Businessweek magazine. And I knew that everybody was going to read it because it was like on the Bloomberg terminal, like in every computer on the trading floor. And before that happened, I did reach out to some colleagues and kind of tell them what had happened. And most people were very supportive, not supportive, but understanding, I guess is the right word. And then Lloyd Blankfein, who was the CEO of Goldman at the time, he issued a statement that like my jaw dropped to the floor when I read it because it was super positive. He said, wouldn't it be great if we could give more people an opportunity who want to come to this country and give us of their talents? It's not the exact quote, but like very close to it. And I was like shocked that he was so positive about it. And I think everybody kind of took a cue from that, right? Like if the CEO is not saying anything negative, then everybody was sort of understanding about it.
What was the process of creating the Ascend Educational Fund, and what are the future plans?
Yeah. So AEF is a college scholarship and mentorship program for New York City students, regardless of their immigration status. So I know you guys go to your high school, so please tell your high school students to apply to the scholarship.
Got you.
Please. I remember when I graduated from college in 2005, like a long time ago, thinking that one day I'm going to start a scholarship fund and I'm going to help students who are now walking through the shoes that I once walked in. And I never forgot that. Like that was always like my big goal in life, was to start a scholarship fund. And it was a very lengthy process. So I actually found a scholarship fund just like Ascend in DC called the Esperanza Education Fund. And I reached out to them, and I was able to get on their board first. So I was on their board for like 2 years, and then really wanted to have something in New York because I knew that the need in New York was also really great. And the process was first getting like 5 other people to want to join me to do this, because it takes like a village, like it takes a big team to do it, because it's a lot of work. And then we went through the process of like becoming a 501c3 so that we could take tax deductible donations. And then we literally went through the New York State Department of Education website and tried to find all of the high schools in New York and their college counselor or the principal or anybody, and spent like months and months and months collecting all this information so that then we could let the high schools know that we had the scholarship fund. And what's really, today I was filling out an application for something, and it asked me what was what am I most proud of? And what I answered was that what I'm most proud of is the 63 students that we have been able to help now. Like, that's what I'm most proud of, is each of those students. For a lot of our students, we started in 2012, which was, so our first scholarships that we gave out was before DACA. So a lot of our students didn't have any immigration status at all. We obviously started before the New York State DREAM Act, and so for a lot of our students, our scholarship is like one of the only financial aid helps that they can get, and so it always makes me really proud to be able to. And now we've had about 8 students that have graduated from college, which makes me really proud.
I will be sure to tell my students about your scholarship.
Tell them. The scholarship. So the application's going to open in about 2 weeks for our 2020 awards.
So what tips do you have for former undocumented immigrants who want to be advocates for current immigrants?
Sorry, say it then.
What tips do you have for former undocumented immigrants who want to be advocates for current immigrants?
Yeah. So this is a tricky question, and I'll tell you why. So I'll say this first. Like, I think, when you're undocumented, you accumulate a lot of trauma that doesn't just go away when you get your papers, right? Like, you spend all this time living your life a certain way, and then all of a sudden you have a green card, and then you become a citizen, which are absolutely like great privileges to have, because it allowed me to be able to go back home and see my mom, because she moved back to Mexico, and I didn't see her for like, 10 years or something. It allowed me to travel outside of the US. It definitely took a big fear of like getting deported, right? So it definitely opened a lot of doors that weren't open for me before, but it didn't just all of a sudden take away all the trauma that I had built over 15 years. And so, and I think, you know, when we talk about being undocumented, we talk about like papers not defining us, right? Like papers don't define undocumented people. And then, so then I think, well, having papers also doesn't define me, right? And, but I also think that, you know, I recognize that every time I share my story, I am taking up space, and I am maybe taking up space that maybe shouldn't belong to me, right? Maybe someone who's still undocumented should be taking up that space and telling that story. And so I'm very conscious of that, and I try very hard to be very careful in the way that I talk about my story, and to say, this is my story. This isn't everybody's story. And, you know, not every undocumented person is gonna go to college. Not every undocumented person is gonna end up working on Wall Street. But every undocumented person still deserves the same amount of dignity that I do. And every undocumented person is still pursuing a better life for themselves that might not look at the way in which I pursued a better life for myself. So, you know, I think sometimes it's not about giving other people a voice, because I think everybody can rise up and have their own voice. Sometimes I think it's about passing the mic and letting other people tell their stories and creating those spaces. And so, you know, I try to do that for other people too. Like, I try to bring other people with me to share their stories and to advocate for themselves. But I also realize that there are times when, if you're still undocumented, you cannot go to the Capitol and get yourself arrested, right? Because that can have very bad consequences. But I am a US citizen now, so I've gotten arrested a bunch of times now, like advocating for the DREAM Act and advocating to save DACA. And so I do try to use the privilege I have as a US citizen now to put myself in situations where people who are still undocumented cannot put themselves in.
Do you think we can include a question around family support and the impact it's had?
Like family support for, like how my family supported me? Yeah, I mean, like my family, you know, my family's been great. My family's made a lot of sacrifices for me to be where I am. When my parents went back to live in Mexico, they took my little brother with them, and he was 8 at the time. And he was born here in the US, but then he grew up in Mexico. And a lot of the violence that was happening was starting to have an influence on my younger brother. And I like knew that I had to bring him back to live with me. So when he was 16, I brought him back to live in the US, and I became his legal guardian and kind of became like his mother, right? Even though like I was only 26. So all of a sudden having like a 16-year-old child. But my family was very supportive, and I think without family support, I don't know how I could have done everything I did, because I also knew that like there was a purpose and a reason why I was doing all the things I was doing. Like my purpose was always bringing back my brother to live with me. My purpose was always helping my mom. My mom had a really bad accident, which is why they went back to Mexico. And she needed a lot of medical care. I mean, she had brain surgery and was like a little girl again. She couldn't talk, and she had to learn how to walk. And that was like years and years of very high medical bills. And the only way I felt like I could afford to get her healthy was to like go get a job on Wall Street and make a ton of money and be able to help my mom. So like family for me has always been like everything, and like the reason why I've done everything I have done. Now I have, so the husband I told you I had before, we got divorced. I talk about it in the book a lot, but I'm remarried, and this time I had like a really bomb proposal in Paris. And I got a beautiful ring, and we had 2 weddings, one in Mexico to make up for not having a quinceañera, and then one in the US. I mean, the reason it's not really because of that. The reason we had to have 2 weddings is because my mom still can't come to the US, and some of my husband's family can't go to Mexico. And I was tired of immigration laws always dictating my life. And now that I can, I was like we're gonna have 2 weddings, one in Mexico and one in the U.S. And my husband now, is incredibly supportive of the work that I do. I travel a lot. Like this month, I've only been home in LA 3 days, the entire month. And he's like my biggest cheerleader. And I'm so happy to have that support because I still don't know how I would do everything I do if it wasn't for family.
If that is not goals, I don't know what is. So this question is completely off script because you did mention, kind of being a parent to your younger brother. And I think that sometimes that we as immigrants who have siblings, that responsibility kind of befalls on us. So where do you think it all came from as soon as you realized you had to take care of him? Like when did it kick in, knowing that you had to step up and be, third parent, so to say?
Yeah. So I'll say a couple of things about that. I mean, when I was 11 and I came to live here, my brother was 1. I mean, I was 11-year-old changing diapers, and now I think 11-year-old girl should not be changing diapers. I should have been playing with my dolls. But that you're right. I think in immigrant household, there's a lot of responsibilities that falls on the kids, right? Even just I remember translating documents for my parents, bank documents, and going with my parents to all parent teacher conferences and translating for my parents, telling my parents the teacher saying I've been bad, and that's a lot of responsibility that falls on young kids. But I think it comes from, I always think it comes from a good place, right? Of family being so important, and you see how much your parents are sacrificing for you, and so you want to step in and help. But to be honest, I also think sometimes that's a little bit unfair to put that much responsibility on a child. And then now you grow up and now you're expected to take care of your parents, right? And you're expected to go to college, get a job, and buy your parents a house. And I absolutely think that's a beautiful thing. I also think it's a big burden to put on a young person who's just trying to figure it out themselves. And there's a lot of battle wounds that immigrants have. I'm actually the next book that I'm writing is all about the battle wounds of assimilation, all of the scars that all of these things leave. And one of the things I'm talking about is exactly this. It's sort of this dynamic of having to take care of your family, and you want to, but at the same time, sometimes I think it is sort of being on a plane where you have to put your mask on first before you help everybody else. Yeah, there's a lot to say there.
I honestly felt that. So this is actually our last question of the night, and it's actually a very good one. What has been one of your greatest life lessons?
Oh, I know. One of my greatest life lessons is that somebody's always going to have something bad to say. And so if you are always worried about pleasing everyone, you will please no one. And I had to learn that because, I get a lot of shit from everybody. I get emails all the time when I'll go on Fox News and talk about this stuff because I think it's important to preach beyond the choir or whatever. But every time I go on, the other day I got a text message that said all sorts of profanities, go back to where you came from, yada yada. And I was really scared when I got that message because I get these kinds of emails all the time, and people can go to my website and send me these messages. But somebody somehow found my phone number and texted me. And that was kind of scary to be if they can find my phone number, they can find out where I live. And so I have to deal with that on that side. But then, I also sometimes get tweets and messages from people who don't think I should be sharing my story, people who, accuse me of all sorts of things. And it used to really get to me, not the stuff on the right, people telling me to go back to where I came from, I really don't care what they say. But it really did used to hurt when people whose team I'm on would send me these kinds of messages, because I thought like I don't have to be doing this. Like, I could have stayed in my job on Wall Street and be making millions of dollars. And sometimes I'm like, man, I should have. But so that used to really be hurtful. But so I had to learn that no matter what I did, no matter what I said, no matter how careful I tried to be in the way in which I speak about things, somebody's still gonna find something wrong with it. And I cannot let that stop me from moving forward and from, I do listen a lot, and like we all are learning, right? So like I have learned some lessons, and I have, people have told me things that I'm saying that are like maybe not helpful to say, and so I've definitely keep sort of like iterating my speeches and iterating the way in which I talk about things. But then sometimes, people they're not really trying to make things better. They're just trying to bring you down. And that's the biggest lesson I've learned, is like you just have to keep pushing forward regardless of what people say.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline. I'm a senior here at John Jay. I actually follow you on Instagram, and yes, I did, and I was just like, oh, this is awesome. But I had a question, because like, what led you to want to write your story? Like, I know it's hard enough telling your story in front of people, but what was that like journey for you to decide to write about yourself?
Thanks for asking that. So in 2009, I wrote in my journal, one day I'm gonna write a book, and all of this is gonna be for something. Like, all of these things that I've been through are gonna have like a purpose and a reason for why they happened. And I even wrote like the names of the chapters and things, and then I forgot about it, right? Like, I went about my life. And then in 2015, I went to Queens to the Museum of the Moving Image, and I watched a film called Documented, which some of you may know who Jose Antonio Vargas is. And it was his story about him being undocumented and using fake papers to work at the Washington Post and at New Yorker magazine. And I remember watching his story in this documentary and thinking to myself, this is my life. And for the first time in my entire life, I feel seen and I feel understood. And I don't feel crazy for feeling everything I felt my whole life, because somebody else had those feelings and somebody else went through this experience. And then I thought, if his story can do that for me, I know that I have a story that I need to share, and maybe it can have that same impact for someone else. And that night I decided that I needed to leave Wall Street, and I wasn't really sure like how to go about it, 'cause, I had no idea. But I actually went to go work with Jose at Define American, and I learned so much from him. And then when I shared my story through this Bloomberg article, that's kind of when everything started happening after that. Then I was like, okay, I really need to write this book, and I'm really glad that I did. I'm really glad that I did.
I think I saw a question on this side.
I think you had a question, right?
Hi, my name's Anthony. My question was, I think you kind of answered this already, but how were you able to stay focused for all those years, knowing that any day it'll all come to an end?
Yeah. In some ways, I think that because I worked in such a high-pressured environment, it almost helped me to take my mind off of the fact that I was undocumented, because I was so I couldn't make a mistake. I felt like I couldn't make a mistake working at Goldman. Everybody around you is like so smart, and everybody around you is like trying to hustle, and so you always feel this pressure to keep up. That's why a lot of people actually burn out from working there, to be honest. But in some ways, for me, that was like the best possible job that I could have, because I had to focus every day on my job, which then took my mind away from always worrying about my immigration status. And there would be periods of time, weeks, maybe a month, where being undocumented wouldn't even like really cross my mind, but then something really big would happen and it would remind me that I was undocumented, right? Like even going out to drinks with friends, I didn't have an ID. And so the only thing I had was like my Mexican passport that didn't have a visa. And I would, but people sometimes would ask me like, oh, why do you carry your passport around? And I could only lie so many times and say I lost my license, right? And so I would have to figure out, okay, I'm gonna get there early or I'm gonna get there late so people don't see me with my passport. And so like things like that would remind me that, okay, I'm still undocumented and I have to worry about this. But then I would go back to my job and I would worry about the next deal that I needed to do, or I would worry about, like the next promotion that I wanted to get or the next race. And all of that helped me to stay really focused on what was right in front of me and not worry about all of these things that I couldn't control. And even now, there's still a million things I can't control. So I try to really focus on those things in which I can make a difference, right? Like I can determine the outcome of this situation by doing something different, and that's where I should spend my time. If I can't control it, then I'm wasting my time worrying about it because there's nothing I can do.
My question is, did you have any regrets like leaving Wall Street, or do you think your passion kind of made it a little bit easier to not look back and like actually keep moving forward and help other people?
Yeah. I don't regret leaving. I think the path that I'm on is the path that I need to be on at this stage in my life. It was a difficult adjustment to go from, I'll tell you this because I've said it before, and you can I was making like almost $400,000 a year, right? And I was like 26, 27 years old. So it was it's a big adjustment to go from that to like, now I don't get a paycheck every 2 weeks, right? Like, I've got to like really hustle to like make things work. I was very good with my money. I saved a lot of money so that the first 2 years that I was doing what I do now, like I had a lot of savings that I could, like, I didn't have to worry about paying my rent. Like I never want to have to worry about paying my rent. I know what that feels like. I grew up with parents that every month was like getting a letter that the rent was 10 days late, or it was, now it's like 2 months, and now we got to decide between like paying the light and paying the phone bill. Like, I knew that I did not want to live like that forever, and I still don't, and I don't. But it was an adjustment to go from that to like this now, right? But I don't regret it for 1 second. I think the biggest thing about what I do now is that I truly feel like my life is mine, and my time is mine, and I can decide how I spend my time. I don't think that has a price tag, And I'm working on I'm working on some things. I'll make that much money again soon.
No, it's okay. What you're doing now is still way better than working.
But by the way, like if anybody here wants to work on Wall Street, like do it, because like a lot of people would be like, oh my God, you're like a sellout because you're working for the man and Wall Street's evil. And yeah, maybe it is, but also like if that's what your goal is, then like go and try it. Figure it out for yourself. You might be there a few years and then realize that's not what you want to do. But like if that's what you feel today that you want to do it. Go for it. Why not?
Hi, my name's Eliana. I go here to John Jay, but I'm from Iowa, and a large part of my family is in southern Missouri. Being from Texas, do you have any advice on talking to conservatives about immigration?
Yeah, so, okay, I'll say two things. One is that I do think that there are some conservative people that truly have an open mind about learning, right? That maybe if they hear an inspirational story, they'll be more inclined to learn more about it. Initially, when I wrote my book, I thought I could help change people's minds and people's hearts, because at the end of the day, I feel like if I could if they could see that I'm just a human like they are, and my heart gets broken like theirs do, and I have goals and ambitions and dreams and aspirations just like everybody else, that they could hopefully change their mind. And I do still think that there's some people, some conservative people that are willing to learn. And some people will say, well, I just wish that people would do it the right way, right? Like I hear that a lot. I hear people say that they don't have a problem with immigrants as long as we do it the right way, and as long as we come here, and the right way, and as long as we get in the back of the line and do it the fair way. And I wrote a whole piece about this, about why this line doesn't exist, right? And so some people, when you have that conversation, like, by the way, there is no application that undocumented people can fill out right now. That's what immigration reform would look like. Immigration reform would create a line for people to get in and apply, right? So it's kind of understanding like where they're coming from. Is it the people need to do it the right way? Is it, well, if people were, I just don't like immigrants because I don't want them to come here and like get on welfare and take advantage of the system. And I think there's a few things to say there. One is that most undocumented people actually don't qualify for any services because you need papers to like apply. And undocumented people do pay taxes. Like, we've paid over $100 billion into the Social Security Fund over the last decade. And that's not me saying it, that's the chief actuary of the Social Security Administration. So it kind of like depends, where they're coming from. But then I have also come to the conclusion that it is okay if we don't change everybody's minds. And actually, I am spending much more of my time empowering people than like trying to change people's minds. So I'll give you an example. I don't know if you guys read about this, but in Texas, there was a teacher in Dallas who thought she was sending DMs to President Trump when she was actually just sending tweets. So like everybody could see the tweets. And like these tweets said things like, my classroom has been overrun by illegals. I need your help to help remove these illegal aliens from my classroom. Okay, she got fired. Good. And I was recently asked to write a piece about reading and writing in the Trump era. And as I was writing this, I was thinking about this teacher. And I was thinking about, I can spend my time trying to talk to that teacher, trying to change her mind about how she sees people like me and people like the kids in her classroom. Or I could spend my time reaching out to those kids in the classroom, making sure that they know that they belong here, making sure that they feel safe and that they feel seen and loved and understood. And I would much rather spend my time doing that. And so that's been like a really big shift in the way that I think about my work. And so, I think that there's some people we can talk to, but it's also okay if we can't change everybody's minds.
Hi, my name is Kelly Rodriguez. As a young Puerto Rican woman trying to work on Wall Street and do finance and accounting, what's the best piece of information that you can help give me to try and reach my goals of that?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna sound like a slogan, but like, just do it. So there's like a few things that you can do. There's a program called Sponsors for Educational Opportunities. I don't know if they come to campus, SEO, but you should look it up. Sponsors for Educational Opportunities. And it's like this really amazing program where you go through the program and they sort of help you get placed on Wall Street, and they give you a mentor, and it's a really incredible program. I think, one of the things I felt when I was first there was having sort of like almost like imposter syndrome, right? Like, do I really belong here? Because I would look to my right and I would look to my left, and there would be people who went to Princeton and went to Yale and went to Harvard, and people whose like grandfather was my boss's like cousin or uncle or whatever, right? And I used to be really intimidated by that. I remember like looking around and being like, oh my God, I don't know how I made it here, and maybe I don't belong here. But then I switched my thinking. I started to think, I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I don't have family who worked here before, and I still have the same job everybody else here has. So that must mean that I'm even smarter and like more hardworking, and I belong here just as much as they do. So it's all about like having that confidence and building that confidence in yourself, that if you're there, that means you belong there. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. So just keep doing it. And I don't know if you were here earlier when I said, like, if you want to go work on Wall Street, then really try to get the highest grades possible. Make it easier on yourself.
So earlier in your book, you talked about the theme of like criminality and the term illegal. I'm wondering what you think about the good versus bad immigrant narrative, and what are you doing to combat that?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about it earlier. So I'll say it again. I think that there is always a danger of creating like, of having like the best intentions and them not having the right result, right? So I do think that sometimes when all the stories that we're hearing are about like dreamers who are in college, who are teachers and doctors and Wall Street executives, then it can be sort of like, well, if you're doing those things, then you're okay. But everybody else that's not doing those things is not. And that is a really big danger. And so the way that I try to combat that is, one, like I said before, like to say, this is my story. This isn't everybody's story. And by the way, the only reason I'm here is because the sacrifices that my parents made. So when we say, dreamers are people who came here through no fault of their own, I don't use the word fault. I use through no choice of our own, because I didn't have a choice in coming here. I came here when I was 11, but I also don't, if I say fault, then that means I'm blaming my parents. And I could never blame my parents for wanting to give me a better life. Right? So I always say that when I'm like talking publicly about it. And it's also about like elevating, like in the New York Times yesterday, it was a really beautiful, amazing piece about the immigrants that live in basements in Queens. So like a lot of the day laborers, right? And it was like they spent days with these migrants and took their pictures and like really put a face to them. And I think elevating those types of stories and making sure that I elevate those stories in the work that I do, and that when I'm talking, this is a very different audience than like the audience I sometimes talk to. So depending on the audience, I'm gonna explain things more, right? Than not. So yeah, it's about like elevating other people's voices, giving other people space, and making sure that people understand that it's not my professional accomplishments that is the reason why people should be sympathetic to my story, right? It is about the fact that like I am a human like everybody else, and that's the reason why I deserve dignity and respect. Like it's not the size of my checkbook or the diplomas I have on my wall, right? But there's always that danger, and we have to combat it the best way we can. And we're all really like learning how to do that, right? Because I also think, I'll give you an example. Like I also think that sometimes, so we all know like there's this horrible things happening at the border, right? With like the kids being taken away from their parents, people getting deported, and like all of these things are happening. But I keep thinking about the I'm gonna use the word dreamer just because that's like the most descriptive word. I keep thinking about how everything going on with dreamers hasn't gone away. You know what I mean? Like just because there are more horrible things happening doesn't mean that all of a sudden dreamers aren't faced with the fact that on November 12th, the Supreme Court could rule, and it could not be a very good ruling, right? Like that problem doesn't go away. And so I think sometimes in our effort to uplift other issues, we forget about the things that are still there. I think a lot about the people who've been deported and how we forget about them. Like after they get deported, we don't talk about them anymore. But 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what happened to that person that got deported? Like, they still exist in the world, but what happened to them? So I've been working like for probably 2 years now to tell those stories, to tell the stories of people who've been deported. Because to me, that's one place where we don't talk at all. You know, we try to stop deportations, which is like a great thing. We should keep doing that. But I want to know, and I want to help 5-10 years from now. Like, where are those people? So I think that there's always like more that we can do. But it's okay if like there are certain organizations that are focusing their efforts on like a specific set of people, right? Like the scholarship fund. Like the scholarship fund, we're focused on helping high school students go to college, and that's like a very direct way. That doesn't mean that we're not also supportive of like direct services to, to immigrants, to migrants that are just coming now. But sometimes, like I said before, like you can't do everything. And we just gotta fight one battle at a time. If anybody has any suggestions, if you have any suggestions on how to combat that and how to do that, would love to listen.
Do folks have any other questions?
Okay, I think one more question.
So, what advice would you give your younger 16-year-old self?
Don't worry, be happy. No, I'm just kidding. No, that's actually good advice. Okay, so this is gonna sound really silly, but I'll give you a couple of them. One, like when I would tell my high school self, and even like my college self, don't worry about that boy. He's not going to be your husband. Because I really think a lot of times, like, I mean, I did. When I was in high school, I used to worry so much about the boy that liked me or didn't like me. And, I remember like when Michelle Obama also talked about how if she would have worried about the boy in high school, then she wouldn't have married Barack, right? And so I think that's actually like good advice. The other piece of advice I would give my younger self is, I mean, I think I said this earlier, which is like you can't please everybody. So don't try. Just like stay focused on what you really believe, and everything's gonna work out fine.
Let's give Julissa another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated all of your questions. They were really thoughtful and insightful questions, and sometimes I don't get those questions, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.